IVM.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch. I'm Aniruddha and with me is my better half, Janice Sequeira. Janice, what are we talking about on the show today?
Okay, so I know this is among our first few recordings still, but we have talked about our love for true crime right from the very beginning. I mean, it's in our bloody promo. So today, we have decided that we are going to share our love for true crime shows with the world. So Aniruddha and I essentially love murder mysteries. We love cop procedurals. We love cop and, robber chase dramas, psycho thrillers in all forms. So whether it's movies, whether they're foreign shows, whether they're documentaries, whether they're reenactments. I mean, we have been murder, mystery and crime junkies for as long as we've been together, right?
So yeah, I mean, essentially here's the thing, right? True crime is something that is a very popular genre lately. And for you and me, you're right. We've just been crime fans in terms of watching shows about whether they're Scandinavian shows, whether they're Nordic shows, police procedurals, the works.
British, American.
All of it. All those, everything that has to do with the solving of a crime. But I think the true crime documentary genre really takes it a step ahead, right? I mean, because you're really moving out of... I think what true crime documentaries do it is that they take us to the scene of the crime. So there is an added layer of voyeurism. There is an added layer of gore. I think true crime documentaries appeal to us more than regular crime stories. Because,
as compared to fiction, you mean?
Yeah, because I think it's essentially the level of voyeurism involved. For example, I mean, when the Neeraj Grover murder happened, you and I were glued to our TV sets, right?
Yeah.
Every time a new story broke or a new development sort of came out, we were all hooked. It wasn't just you and me, it was the entire country. So those kind of stories, whether it's crimes of passion, whether they are murders carried out by people who make for interesting case studies as psychopaths, just, sort of tend to get our interest. And I think there's nothing better than presenting that in a documentary format.
Yeah, because also with documentaries, especially with unsolved cases, right? Like, for example, with the Talwars, right? What happened in Delhi, the Arushi Talwar case, or with, like you said, even the Neeraj Grover case while it was still ongoing, or so many of the international ones that we have loved, right? There's always this element of, will the documentary filmmaker finally, after all these years, crack something that we didn't know about? Or that's what happened in the case of, for example, one of the shows that we're going to talk about today, The Jinx, right? Where he eventually did get something, and that's what caught national and international attention. But with documentaries, there's also that added element of, like you said, voyeurism. We were talking on the way here, I remember we were talking about how the documentary on Ted Bundy that's on Netflix right now sort of sexualizes him, makes him this, guy that women sort of find appealing. What's your take on stuff like that? When documentary filmmakers have a certain gaze on how they present their subjects and, of course, also the stance that they take.
Look, what differentiates documentaries from fiction shows, right? The beauty of a documentary is that these are events that have actually taken place. So every time there is a twist in the tale, every time the case unfolds a little bit more and you discover newer aspects, I think that's what makes documentaries so much more interesting. Now, while all of that material kind of really exists in the real world, it really is left up to the filmmaker to take all that material and to turn it into 7, 8, 10 hours of interesting television, which is where the craft comes in. Now, what has happened as a result of the popularity of Making a Murderer, which was really the first documentary that blew up in a really big way, is that Netflix has gone ahead and commissioned a large number of documentaries, a lot of them which come out every year.
Yeah.
Now, as a result, what's going to happen is that two things are at play here, right? The audiences want to watch these documentaries, which is why these documentaries are being commissioned. Several researches have been done around the world. Several criminal psychologists have come out and spoken about the fact that what does that tell about us as the audience, right? The fact that we love that level of gore. We love that level of voyeurism. We love, the fact that we are addicted to crime. So that's one aspect. The other criticism that has come the way of true crime documentaries is the fact that the filmmakers tend to not always present the truth, because in the process of trying to tell a really interesting story, authenticity suffers. Now, these are just really conversations, debate points. We don't have to take them too seriously because we don't know about the veracity of what is true and what is not. But I feel that it really comes down to the honesty and the commitment of the filmmaker, and that comes through. So, for example, when you gave the example of Ted Bundy, which we tried to watch a few episodes of and then completely tuned out of, because we felt like while there was a really interesting story to tell, it was just something we'd watched before. But Making a Murderer or The Jinx, for example, are documentaries where even when filmmakers have taken a very clear stance, where they've either sided with the victim or they've been very clear about who they feel the culprit is, they've managed to tell those stories in a very effective manner. They've managed to put together all the facts, all the real life facts of a case and present them in interesting 6, 8, 10 episode formats. And I think there's that craft that we need to appreciate more than sometimes what the shows are trying to say, because there is so much material available online. You don't really need to watch a show and make up your mind about anything. You can just then go out there, read opinions on social media, read think pieces, read articles, go out and actually read case files which are now available online and make up your mind about what you feel about that specific case, right?
I don't know. I mean, I think for me, that's not always true. We spoke about The Jinx, where it was very clear that, the makers had a very, they had a stance. They, from the first episode, you knew that they're looking at the main subject in a certain sort of light, like he's guilty. Similarly, with Making a Murderer, you knew from the first episode that the makers are looking at Avery with a very sympathetic glance. But I don't know. I think sometimes the midway ground, where the makers try to stay slightly neutral, maybe in a docu-series like The Keepers, another docu-series that's on Netflix, there wasn't that kind of a gaze. You knew from the very beginning that a crime had taken place, that this nun had died, but the motives, the reason, who done it, the whole who done it of it was sort of done very organically, where you eventually realize, there's a much larger plot at play. But I feel like that also sometimes works for me. This entire, from the first episode or from the first few minutes, knowing what the filmmaker's take is and what he or she is thinking about the subject and case, it sometimes does color my vision. Like, I have to be honest, I've thought back and gone like, did they manipulate my feelings, or did I actually feel like that about Andrew Avery? Not Andrew Avery, what's his name? Stephen Avery.
Look, filmmakers are human beings, right? When we read a piece of information, we tend to form an opinion. And when you are creating a documentary, you're coming across so much research material, you're coming across footage that you're either recording or you are sort of procuring. And in the process of going through that footage, going through the text, you are going to be, at the end of the day, going to be able to form an opinion.
Yeah.
And I would rather watch a documentary where the filmmaker seems to have an opinion, because that means clarity of vision. That means that the filmmaker is being able to communicate the story, I feel, in a much better manner than a filmmaker who's just trying to be balanced and safe. But at the same time, while I agree that it entails a certain level of manipulation along the way, I think people are smart enough to now, go out there and double check and recheck things themselves.
No, I disagree so much with that, because, I mean, maybe it's the journalist in me, where we've always been taught that, you sort of go into any story with an open mind, and that there may be more than one sort of narrative that you eventually will get to draw. But
I agree.
Again,
Look,
of course, the liberty that documentary filmmakers are taking is also the fact that they've lived with the subject for so long. So after a point, probably the human bias, you can't help but, the material you've got, the subject you've covered, you've interviewed them, or you spent time with people who are close to them or people who are close to the case. So I guess you can't help that bias. But I'm just saying, from a narrative point of view, I have sort of looked back at some of these documentaries that we've watched over the years and gone like, no, I'm not sure whether I felt about the person so strongly, or it was because of the way the material was edited, the narrative, the way you took, it's also about how you piece all those interviews together, right? Every documentary, the essence of most documentaries is the people who are talking, the people who are commenting, the footage that you have, the evidence that you've gathered over the years. And the way you present that and where you piece that together is how you eventually form your own opinion. When the filmmaker's already presenting a certain opinion, I feel like that tends to then sometimes I look back at it and I'm like, nahi. Sometimes I feel like ye zyada manipulation ho gaya.
No,
Like,
so are you telling me when you watched Leaving Neverland, you decided that just because the filmmakers were supporting the stance of the victims, would you then not pay credence to what they are trying to say?
No, of course. But I'm saying that actually Leaving Neverland is a tough one, right? Because it's not...
I'll tell you what I think. I feel that every story has two sides to it. You spoke about being a journalist, and I completely agree. Even when we would be reporting stories about a certain event, what you can do as a journalist and what you can do as a documentary filmmaker is you can try to bring all the sides. But at some point, even as a storyteller or as a journalist, if you're covering a story for a really long amount of time, over a period of time, you are as a human being going to form an opinion.
No, I agree. I just said that.
So that opinion has to come through because I mean, if it doesn't, then it will come across as a botched attempt to begin with. And second, I do agree that, I mean, that's what filmmaking is, right? We forget that at the end of the day, a documentary is supposed to, it uses visuals and sound to make audiences feel in a certain way.
Right.
Can there be manipulation? Yes. Should we be sort of wary of propaganda films which sort of use, a certain topic just to further one's agenda? Yes, absolutely. Which is why I feel that rather than us making up our minds about any specific thing, for me, all these documentaries that we are talking about have not been about what the filmmakers have been trying to say alone. It's been my window into a certain case, into a certain world, which I have then gone out and read about and been able to form an opinion about.
This is true.
So that's what Making a Murderer did for me, for example, because Making a Murderer, which since we are now talking about it, let's just go into it. Making a Murderer is about the filmmakers being extremely sympathetic towards the so-called culprit of the story, which is Stephen Avery. Because you realize over a period of watching the show that the filmmakers are convinced that he's innocent. And it is important for the filmmakers to be convinced he's innocent because the documentary is about miscarriage of justice.
Correct.
So you can't make a documentary about miscarriage of justice if you are not going to be sympathetic to the so-called culprit who you actually believe is the victim. On the other hand, The Jinx is a show where the filmmaker is convinced that the subject, which is Robert Durst, is a culprit, or the fact that he is, he has performed all the acts that
he's been accused of.
And so then it becomes about the sort of uncovering of that crime or of that human being. So I feel these are two really opposite and different documentaries. Both work, both are effective, both take extremely different sort of stances against or for the accused victims. And I feel that because both the filmmakers are so convinced about their point of view on those victims, it works.
All right, so we'll debate this some more in the next segment. Ani and I are going to go deep dive into Making a Murderer and The Jinx.
Look, up in the internet. It's a meme. No, it's a cat video. No, it's the Geek Fruit Podcast.
That's right. We interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, The Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.
Welcome back. You're still listening to Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch. Now, before we took a break, Aniruddha and I told you guys that we'd be deep diving into some of our favorite true crime documentaries. The first of which, of course, we're going to talk about is The Jinx. Now, guys, what an interesting life this man, Robert Durst, who is the subject of The Jinx, what an interesting life this man has led. The documentary series was made by a filmmaker called Andrew Jarecki, who was quite obsessed with Robert Durst's life. But Robert Durst himself is a really weird, cool character. I mean, I started reading about him last night after having watched this documentary in 2015, and I felt myself going back into a black hole. Like, I think I'd happily even read another book about this guy's life. So who is Robert Durst, right? Robert Durst is a real estate heir. He's been accused of not one, not two, but 3 murders. So one is in the 1980s, his wife disappeared, and now the family for the last over 30 years has been claiming that, she's possibly been murdered by Robert Durst. Then in 2000, Robert Durst was accused of the murder of his best friend Susan Berman. And then in 2001, he was accused of the murder of his neighbor, Maxwell Black. So Robert Durst is this character who, the way this documentary series played out is that he was very taken in by Andrew Jarecki's film about his life, and he approached Andrew Jarecki to do a series of interviews and to sort of prove his innocence. And he reached out to Jarecki and said, I'd like to do a series of interviews with you, proving my innocence and sort of disproving all these claims against me. And that's really where the story of the documentary began, right, Aniruddha?
Right. So I think we started watching the documentary because there was all this news stories about how Robert Durst was arrested. I think this was in the pre-Netflix, Hotstar, Amazon era. So we literally read about it online, and I had to go looking for the episodes, because it wasn't easily available.
Yeah.
And I remember us watching it over a period of a couple of days. And I mean, like you said, the 3 murders is not what makes it so compelling. I mean, crimes keep taking place in America all the time and around the world. But Robert Durst is such a fascinating character, right? He's born with a silver spoon, super rich guy. Believes that, we keep hearing about miscarriages of justice because upper class people get away with it. But this wasn't just that. He's a real character. When you watch the documentary, you realize that. And so, Andrew Jarecki, the filmmaker who had made this fantastic documentary called Capturing the Freedmans back in the day. It was a feature film, and we'd watched it, I think, many years ago, and we'd really enjoyed it. He then went on to make a fiction film called All Good Things, which had Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst in it. And that was based on the Robert Durst murders. So Robert Durst, in a sense, was this personality in the US who people were interested in. So there was already a feature film made. And like you pointed out, it's so damn interesting that Robert Durst himself got in touch with Andrew Jarecki after watching All Good Things. And said that I want to meet you,
Yeah, he was really impressed with the film that he'd made on his life.
Yeah, and, it tells us so much about this character, who's this psychopath, but clearly has a really heightened sort of opinion of himself. He's not afraid to put himself out there. He's not afraid to get in touch. Most filmmakers would have difficulty trying to get in touch with somebody who's been accused of murders.
And someone as reclusive as a Robert Durst.
Yeah, and here's a guy who reaches out to the filmmaker and says that, hey, he found a film where he's meant to be a murderer interesting. That tells you so much about that guy.
Yeah.
And essentially, that was the genesis of the documentary. That's how it began. Jarecki basically started spending time with Durst. Several interviews took place, got Jarecki's interest. Initial research had already been done on the feature film he made, so he went on to do some more. What I really liked about The Jinx is that it essentially applies this technique of visual reenactments. Now that, there is a very popular docudrama format, which is that you have a documentary series, but there are certain parts of the documentary series which are fictionalized or reenacted. We saw that in a documentary like Wormwood as well, which is out on Netflix. But what The Jinx did wasn't just that. He wasn't really going into fictionalizing any of the stories. What he was really doing was making these really stylized reenactments of what was actually being spoken on the documentary. None of the actors who were being shot, their faces were never shown.
Yeah.
So it was almost an storytelling visual aid, which basically aided what they were trying to tell through the documentary, which I thought was a really smart move. And I think Jarecki, really, you brought all his documentary filmmaking experience to turn a simple interview format into a very compelling series. And I mean, you were telling me the other day, right? Because you were reading up about the show and you spoke about how there was a lot of criticism and fingers pointed at Jarecki after the show came out.
This goes back to the conversation we were having earlier, Aniruddha, is that does the filmmaker's gaze, does the fact that he or she has such a strong opinion which comes through in the narrative of the documentary, does that make a difference to what to your entire neutral journalistic documentary stance, right?
Yeah, but listen, listeners might be confused here because we just said that Durst got in touch with Jarecki. Even though Durst got in touch with Jarecki's entire stance was very clear that Durst
he said from day one that
he believed that Durst was the murderer.
So here's actually how it went. Robert Durst has given interviews about how he approached Jarecki because he wanted Jarecki to showcase the fact that he was innocent and that all these charges against him were untrue. But Jarecki from day one told him, I'm going to present your story. I'm obsessed with your story. I want to do justice to it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to give you a clean chit at the end of it. And of course, as history shows what happened, I mean, Robert Durst was arrested a day before the finale aired because of new evidence that came to light during the documentary. So, The Jinx is one of those documentaries that a lot of people who've reviewed it and, a lot of documentary filmmakers and journalists who've written about it talk about it as being one of those dream projects where already the subject is so interesting. I mean, there are things about Robert Durst's life that are so damn weird and strange. Like, for example, after 2000, when he was accused of the murder of his best friend, Susan Berman, he started living life as a fugitive. He was on the run. There was a massive manhunt for him. So he moved to Texas. And what does he do in Texas? Because he doesn't want to be recognized, he starts cross-dressing as an old mute woman. And the only person who knew of his identity is the person who in 2001 was murdered, his neighbor.
What a weird story.
I don't even know how you would think, because also, when we're looking at Robert Durst's interviews, and Jarecki's done a series of interviews with him, right? You're looking at him and you're just like, this could be an average Joe, a rich average Joe, of course. But how does one think of cross-dressing, living as an old mute woman in a different state while there is a massive manhunt, national manhunt going on? So, Robert Durst is definitely one of those characters. I said this earlier as well. Like, we watched the movie that was based on his wife's disappearance. We watched the documentary series, The Jinx, which we're talking about right now. But even if there was a book to come out tomorrow about him, I would probably read it.
Chances are Jarecki would be the author of that too.
Yeah, so I'm going back to the point about it being the dream project. So you've got a creepy, weird subject. You've also got, all of the real estate tycoon, the boy who was born with the silver spoon but was a loner, and there was, tons of sibling rivalry stories growing up. So the subject is interesting. Secondly, you've got him accused of 3 murders, out of which, wife's disappearance and possibly being dead was never really fully proved. Susan Berman, his best friend's death, which he was accused of, again, they could never really prove it. And the third one, this is the most interesting thing. He was accused of his neighbors, like murdering his neighbor, chopping up the neighbor into many, many pieces and dumping him in the nearby water body. He was acquitted in that murder.
Right.
Like, it went to trial and he said he did it in self-defense.
Right.
So you've already got, the case is interesting, subject is interesting, and of course the most important thing is that you want something to come out. You feel like this is a story that has been written about, sab log ne pad liya, stories are being made, and yet at the end of it, Jarecki walked away with that one crucial piece of recording which sort of eventually turned the case on its head.
Which makes me wonder, would we really care about The Jinx if it did not end with Jarecki accidentally getting a confession out of Durst, which finally implicated him on a case that he had been running scot-free from for a couple of decades? I think what makes The Jinx such a great damn documentary is that it is that dream of every journalist / filmmaker / documentary storyteller,
correct.
That when they are trying to document a well-known crime, they stumble upon something new. That's the least that you want to achieve with your documentary.
Correct.
But you don't just stumble upon something new. Your documentary is the reason why the subject finally gets arrested, and there
Yeah.
is there is an entire trial that takes place. I think that really speaks about the power of the medium. I mean, that I think is every documentary filmmaker's wet dream come true. So I think that's what really got our interest as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember you sort of being very excited about all these stories that were coming on. You were like, we have to watch the
Yeah,
Jinx.
because I think I came across a tweet about the confession, and then I just went all crazy reading about it. Several think pieces. There were stories in New York Times. There were all these discussions happening about whether Jarecki's process was right, because actually he got criticized from both ends.
Yeah.
On one end, critics thought that if Durst is the one approaching him, what kind of a relationship does he have with him, and how is it going to come out there? And on the other hand, Durst's defense lawyers felt that he tricked him into making that confession.
In fact, Durst's lawyers have talked in great detail about how that recording, which, Durst sort of mumbled certain things about the case when he thought the mic was off, but actually the mic was still on and he was in the bathroom. So Durst's lawyers have gone on to talk about how Durst actually said a lot more, but that these two lines were taken out of context and misrepresented in
That's
the
like
documentary.
a classic defense lawyer
which
technique.
also
It
makes...
happens with journalists. It happens like our thing has been taken out of context.
Why can't we play devil's advocate and think, like, just like you asked me 2 minutes ago, that what if Robert Durst had not made that revelation?
No, absolutely.
Then
Look.
would we be interested in
No,
the Jinx?
hold
Maybe
on.
not.
If this case has gone to court now,
Huh.
all right, I am sure that the court is not only going to stick to the parts that were used in the documentary.
Correct, huh.
That only makes the documentary itself interesting. What it has done is that now it's opened up the court case. And in court, they are going to investigate. It's not like they're going to watch. The judge is not going to watch 6 episodes of The Jinx and be like, "Okay, here's my judgment."
I don't
That's not
think
what's
that's
going to
how it
happen.
works.
But I think what Jarecki managed to do was he get the case reopened,
Yeah.
and I think that is a real triumph. And I think that moment, which comes in the finale, where Durst is speaking into the mic when he's in the bathroom, and he actually saying those words, and you're listening to it. It is it is documentary gold.
Yeah, and also
it's
at that...
spine chilling as viewers to actually hear him say those things.
And by then also because you've seen so many interviews of this character, and you know how he sounds when he's a little ticked off. You know how he sounds when he's being cocky and confident.
Correct.
Then suddenly when he has this little burst where he feels like Jarecki's caught him, and it comes also again the way they've presented the evidence in the last 2 episodes, which leads up to that finale moment of, Durst saying what he does. Oof, that's just, I mean,
You
I don't
can't script
forget
that
about the
shit.
ethics. I think it's just beautiful to watch. Like
Yeah.
for us, it was like, oh shit, usne sach mein bola kya ye? So it was quite cool.
You can't script that shit. So yeah, The Jinx is by far one of the best true crime documentaries that I have watched and you have watched.
Yeah,
all
without a
episodes
doubt.
are streaming on Hotstar because it's an HBO show. And
Once again, the best investment you ever made, Hotstar. That HBO library is
that
gold.
HBO library is gold. Even though it's a 4-year-old show now, I think it's pretty relevant and it's easily bingeable. So it's an easy watch. You guys can go ahead, watch it. Tell us what you think about the show in the comments. And on the other side of this break, Janice and I will be talking about the Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
All right, and we're back and we're still talking about true crime documentaries that Aniruddha and I love. Now we're going to go into a show which is possibly the world's most popular true crime documentary.
Easily.
Yeah. I think Making a Murderer is that, like, you throw a stone and even a person who doesn't watch anything related to true crime, they have probably watched Making a Murderer.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, Netflix's flagship true crime documentary show.
Yeah.
It's got 2 seasons out on Netflix. And Ani, before we get into discussing the documentary, you want to tell us a little bit about what the documentary sort of covers?
Yeah, so Making a Murderer, I remember being completely transfixed by, because the story is so damn intriguing. So essentially it begins, we were talking earlier about crafting documentaries and about twists and turns and plot turns. it essentially begins with the arrest of a man called Stephen Avery for the attempted rape and murder of a woman when he was, I think, in his 20s. This was back in the 1980s, I think, the end of the 1980s, right? And essentially, he was arrested due to the testimony of the woman. And there was huge furor even at that point of time about how there was not enough evidence to convict him. But he did get convicted. And there were several appeals and reappeals that took place over a period of 17 years.
Yeah.
And finally, at the end of 2005 is when he was acquitted of that murder. Now, that's just the setup. I mean, 17 years worth of story is covered in, I think, the first episode or the first couple of episodes. That in itself is so interesting because you basically told us that there was this one man who was essentially not guilty, but had to serve 17 years in prison. And that was meant to be a statement on the sort of American justice system and the loopholes in them. Then the real story begins, which is that 2 years later, the same man gets arrested for the murder of a woman called Teresa Hallback.
Rape and murder.
Rape and murder of Teresa Hallback. And this time, there is insurmountable evidence against him. But at the same time, what the documentary does over the first season is finds loopholes in even that case. And, you know, as we speak, Stephen Avery is still in prison.
Yeah.
Several appeals have taken place before and after the documentary. When the documentary first came out, the first season, of course, like we were discussing earlier, it became a part of public discourse. Right. So the documentary went beyond just entertaining. It became a part of people's lives, right? Yeah. There were several social media accounts that were dedicated to, you know, getting Stephen Avery acquitted. There were appeals, there were reappeals, there were marches, you know, against the Manitowoc County, which was the one that had, you know, sort of built the entire case against Avery. So I remember being completely blown away by just the mere facts of the documentary and the way they were presented. And can you, I mean, just you know, the mind boggles to think that there's a man that you, me, and so many millions around the world who have watched the documentary believe is innocent, who had been wronged by the system once and been let off and is now still spending time in prison. It's just crazy. It's human interest at the highest level.
So, you know, one of the things that was so interesting about Making a Murderer is that in the first 3 episodes of the documentary series, the makers have taken so much time to not just build up Stephen Avery's case and the fact that when he was arrested in the 80s, there wasn't that much evidence against him. But they've also taken a great deal of time to build up multiple characters in the Manitowoc County. Right? It almost like in the first 2-3 episodes where you're talking about, you know, injustice, a man having spent 18 or 17 years, you know, when he was actually not even the guy who eventually, like later on, evidence proved that he wasn't the guy who tried to rape and murder the woman. But they've painstakingly sort of made sure to build up a lot of characters within the Manitowoc County. So whether it's the defense head, whether it's the attorney general, whether it's members of the police, it's about the community. Like a lot of Making a Murderer for me, yes, it's about the fascinating crime, but it's also about the setting.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't like to use this term very loosely, but they sort of do hint at the whole white trash culture a lot, right? Because Stephen Avery and his family would be sort of categorized under, like, you know, what a lot of documentaries, a lot of films and a lot of pop culture refers to as possibly, like, you know, being referred to as white trash. They're not very cultured, you know, they're not very popular, they don't sort of have the right mannerisms, they don't communicate effectively, and also because they were considered troublemakers within their community at the Manitowoc County, how the police and people within the legal and justice system within that county always had a bias against Stephen Avery and his entire family.
Right, absolutely.
So, I mean, for me, it's, you know, the reason I remember being blown away was, of course, because the crime itself is so fascinating. That can this county and can all these people who have been shown to be so prejudiced against the Avery family, can they send Stephen Avery back to prison again for yet another crime that he hasn't committed? And the second most interesting part is that, so of course, first 3 episodes, you realize guy's been wrongly convicted. He's been sent to prison. In 2003, he's finally, after a lot of fanfare, because of new DNA evidence, is released. And then 2 years later, once again, there's a case against him, and that's the Teresa Halbach case. Over there, I think the new nuance, the fact that they got the whole Brandon Dassey story.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself deserves so much conversation, because one of my haunting memories of Making a Murderer is, the footage that they have of the interview with Brandon Dassey.
Correct.
The damning interview, which eventually leads to both of them being arrested. I mean, that interview, I remember when we were watching that episode, it was sort of, we talk about police.
Yeah.
We talk about how the police manipulate evidence. We talk about, how they know these techniques or how to coerce a confession. That is possibly, for me, like, if anyone ever were to ask me, like, what is an example of that? Go watch this in Making a Murderer.
Yeah. We were discussing this in an earlier podcast. When you want to understand the working of the American justice system, don't look any further than Making a Murderer. Because it has pretty much every aspect of a case that you can imagine. There is a victim. There is a suspect. You can't call him anything more than that. There is a suspect to begin with. Then there is a collection of evidence that we see. Then we see the interrogation part of it, like you mentioned, Brendan Dassey, who was essentially the nephew of Stephen Avery. And there is this, like you were talking about, there's a spine-chilling moment in the documentary where 2 police officers are trying to coax a confession out of Dassey, and Dassey was underage at the time when the confession was taken.
Interview with him.
And if there is even the tiniest possibility that Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery actually did not commit the crime that they've been convicted for, it essentially means that history repeated itself. And how?
Yeah.
Because Stephen Avery, who was a young man arrested in the 80s, spent 17 years in prison, came out completely broken, having lost the best years of his life, sent back in. That's one level of the one layer of the story. The second is that another 17-year-old guy has now spent 14 years in prison. And if he was arrested in 2005, it's been 14 years. So if ever there is new evidence and if the judgment is upturned, it'll mean that just like Avery, Dassey too has lost the best years of his life to prison. Apart from that, we were talking about the gaze. I think the beauty of Making a Murderer is that when it starts off, it is really not trying to make any kind of a statement. It is just putting the facts out as they are. And I think around the 4th or 5th episode, when facts begin to emerge, when the audience themselves begin to believe that Stephen Avery is actually innocent, is when the filmmakers seem to really start making the statement against the way evidence is collected, against how lawyers use loopholes to, sort of build a case against a suspect, about how the police is sort of hands in glove with a lot of forensic experts and lawyers in trying to prove a case. Now, depending on which side of the line you stand on, whether you believe Avery is innocent or guilty, it remains a fascinating exercise to watch, right?
It does. The thing is that I remember sort of when we were... so this is how the filmmakers would do it, right? They start showing us that this is the evidence that they've got against Avery. This is the evidence they've got against Dassey. This is, that they have this huge plot of land, which is sort of like a dump yard where cars are sort of dumped, like, old used cars are dumped. Yeah. And that is also where remains of Teresa Halbach's body are found. There are, blood splatters that are found within Avery's car, in his dicky. And, they show us all this evidence. Okay, you've got this, and you're thinking, oh, okay, maybe Avery really can't, there's no way he's innocent. And then over the course of the next few episodes, they, through the lawyers, through, outside private investigators, they sort of start to break down each of that evidence and show us how that could actually be manipulated. I remember at that point thinking in my head that this is what they must talk about when they say, don't get on the wrong side of the police, right? Because the extent to which they've shown the amount of hatred that this county or that the lawmen and the lawmakers in this one county have for the Avery family, it's a little unbelievable, right? I mean, you feel like, is it really possible? Could you have manipulated evidence to this extent just to get this guy implicated? I mean, do you also feel like, and this is a question I want to ask you, like now that we're talking about it, do you feel like they're biased against him in the beginning of the season, right? Whatever the reasons they don't like Stephen Avery and his family.
Right.
Do you feel like that could justify the police going to these extents?
I think it
or
goes...
do you think it was about ego?
I think it goes beyond bias and it goes beyond ego. If you just look at the plain facts, a guy spends 17 years in prison, right, for a crime he did not commit. He's then acquitted. There is media uproar around the country. And then there is a huge possibility that Stephen Avery is going to now sue the county for millions and millions of dollars. There was no way in hell. So this is the most popular conspiracy theory around making a murderer, right? Which is that why is it that what you just asked me, why is it that the cops would go after one man, one family repeatedly after having been proven wrong the first time? And the most popular theory is that they had reason to do so because the state, the county would have gone bankrupt
if they had won the lawsuit.
If they had won the lawsuit, which they had huge chances of, which they would have definitely won because the 17-year incarceration was pretty well documented. All the mistakes that had been made by the police was pretty well documented. But the moment he was arrested the second time, all of that goes for a toss. It then you start raising questions about, did he actually commit it the first time as well? So, you are essentially trying to build a case, against a man, against a family over not 1, 2, 3 years, over 30 years. It's been on since like the first time he got arrested was in the mid 80s. And what a life that is, right? Where you are constantly just fending off, sort of people who dislike you within the community.
Yeah.
And you're right, it raises questions about class. It raises questions about, if you are part of a neighborhood and you are not,
or you're from the wrong side of town.
Or you are not looked down upon as a good influence in the community. What could it entail for you and your family?
Yeah. Which also, I sort of, the first season, of course, was remarkable. I mean, in terms of storytelling, in terms of the way they built the narrative. I particularly loved how they used Stephen Avery, because let's remember that Stephen Avery was actually not on camera for a lot of the documentary. I mean, of course, they kept cutting to footage of him, especially when he was released, his younger days. And
there are audio recordings, of course.
But it's the audio recordings. That's what I was getting to. Like, I love how they've used conversations with Stephen Avery from prison throughout the entire, like it's almost like he's the narrator of the documentary, but you never really see his face. It's his footage. It's the audio recording that's sort of looping and threading it all together.
Yeah, and actually, when you talk about the 2 seasons individually, the first season, of course, when it came out, like you pointed out, became this overnight rage. Essentially covered 30 years of their lives, right? It basically started in whenever the first murder took place and caught up to when the documentary came out, right? So it was pretty up to date in that sense. So when a second season came out on the same story, you really wondered if there was anything else left to A, explore, and B, the time frame of the second season, which covers from when the first season came out around 2015, 2016, to when the second season came out is just a couple of years.
Yeah.
But even then, in season 2, what they've done is that they've used, they've essentially introduced a new character, so to speak, of Kathleen Zellner, a really famous lawyer who's known to take up cases of wronged criminals and get them justice, who takes on the case of Stephen Avery largely because of the popularity of season 1. So again, just like The Jinx, we are talking about the impact a documentary is making in the real world. And it essentially follows her, sort of finding ways to prove that Avery is innocent. And that's really fascinating because while the first season, like you said, was a story that was unfolding from the point of view of Avery, from a more personal sort of human interest point of view. The second one was entirely law-based, right? It was entirely from the point of view of the lawyer.
It felt like they'd found a new protagonist, because obviously you couldn't just have Stephen Avery all over again talking about the... Because
Same
let's be
things,
honest,
right.
I mean, in these 2 years that, that they took a break and they made season 2, there weren't that many developments in the case. What the makers did have is that they sort of had a new protagonist, right?
Yeah.
In Kathleen Zellner.
Yeah.
But I have to be honest, as exciting and as delicious TV as season 1 was, season 2, after a point, you have to admit, did sort of drag on
But
its
Janice,
feet.
it could never better season
Of
1.
course,
There was no
of
way in hell.
course.
When it's like you hit peak in season 1. Any show, like Making a Murderer season 1 was such a cultural phenomenon, and it's like it's that classic sequel problem, right?
Ki haan, it will
like
never live up to
Age
it.
of Ultron, however good or bad it might be, can never be better than the first Avengers, right? Because the first Avengers leaves such a great impact on you.
Which brings me to the question, right? Do you feel just that, the makers and Netflix realize, oh my God, this is a goldmine property, right? And there is so much curiosity about Making a Murderer, and people are still interested because, of course, by the time the Making a Murderer had ended on Netflix, it had become a worldwide phenomenon. And now,
Right.
we were talking about, it had like social media groups, people outside courts, everyone was following the Stephen Avery and
Right.
Brandon Dassey case. Do you feel like just wo lalach mein aake they made season 2?
No, I thought that...
Because I don't know what was the big high in season 2.
I get what you're trying to say. I thought so too initially. For my first question was, is there really a story left to be told? Because we are all convinced about the fact that Avery is innocent, or at least I was, or the large number of audiences were. And now we just really want to know what happens after that. I mean, we can just follow that up on news stories and stuff like that. So I felt like the meat would be missing. You're right. They realized that the only way the documentary could remain interesting is if they infused new life in it. And that's how the Kathleen Zellner character became the mainstay.
Correct.
I agree with you that season 2 wasn't as, sort of as scintillating as season 1 for obvious reasons. One, season 1 had so much more story to cover.
Correct.
In terms of just developments and plot twists and, just various, new elements coming out. You could not beat season 1 in that. But having said that, while I do agree that season 2 was not as great as season 1, it was still not really a bad season. Or I think Making a Murderer season 2 had a Herculean task, and I think while it may not have been as great as 1, it still was compelling TV.
I don't know. In my head, I just feel like, what is the big give off for the audience at the end of it? Like, what is my takeaway, right? At least season 1
The
left
takeaway
me...
is
No,
that
season 1 left...
that the justice system has continued to screw with this family.
I get it, but my point is that it feels repetitive, right? Because even at the end of season 2, it's not even like you're constantly like, okay, Kathleen Zellner is filing all these petitions. Kathleen Zellner is uncovering all of the evidence. Kathleen Zellner is understanding the landscape of how this could possibly not have been done by Stephen Avery and Brandon Dassey. I get all that. And I'm constantly thinking that by the end of the season, it's going to take me to a place where at least there's a new twist in the case. And that unfortunately never happened. Probably because season 1
Janice,
ruined it for
this
us.
is a real story, right? I mean,
I get
when
it.
you talk about it, it's like, yaar, season 2 mein plot twist nahi tha because...
mat banao na. Kathleen
No.
Zellner ko tumne, I don't understand itna kya important tha ki you had to tell us. We could have followed any of this on the
Look,
news.
I'll tell you what. It's really simple. There is always this fascination that audiences have when something ends, that what happened after that, right? And I think that's what that was the only purpose of the season. The purpose of the season was not to, because, I mean, what season 1 achieved, it could not do it because, I mean, like I said, maybe it came out too soon. Maybe if it had come out like 5, 7, 8 years later when there were more developments, it would have been more interesting. But I feel that we should not be viewing it from that prism, because the purpose of the documentary is not only to entertain. I think the purpose of the second season was purely to document what happened after the first season. You might be right about the fact that maybe too many interesting developments didn't take place, but does that mean that the documentary should not have been made? The season 2 should not have been made? I disagree. I feel that the job of season 2 was to update audiences on the case, what has happened. There were moments in the documentary in season 2 which I felt like the storytelling dipped, or where it wasn't as interesting, but at the end of the day I felt it performed a function.
I also felt bad for the makers because ultimately you only got that much footage to play with, right? In season 2, it felt like if we have to see any more of that entire land that the Avery family owned, I would have pulled my hair out by the end of it.
Yeah, but
because it's such a boring landscape at the end of it, right? It's only towards the end of the season where we suddenly see new elements, which of course we won't spoil it for you guys completely because वैसे भी कम ही spoilers है ये second season में. But I'm just saying that I felt like, there was no need to really make a season 2 in such a rush. It could have waited a few more years. Making a Murderer is now a cult show. Even if you brought it back 3 years later, like even now.
But did you binge watch it on the weekend that
of
it
course
come
we
out?
did.
But that's it. So the purpose has been...
So Netflix has successfully tricked us into it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like in season 2, they are self-referential. Making a Murderer is being mentioned everywhere. It's like you create a documentary which becomes a worldwide phenomenon, and then you're right, somewhere they are trying to cash in on it. But I'm saying while in the process of cashing in on it, it still is performing a function of becoming a document, which is what it's meant to be. Chapter 2.
Maybe just what I'm telling our audiences is that, because season 1 is so brilliant, keep your expectations in check for season 2.
That's fair. If you've not watched Making a Murderer, season 1 is going to blow your minds away. Season 2 is not supposed to blow your mind away, but you must watch it because if you want to stay up to date.
Season 2 is to fill that void कि क्या हो रहा है Stephen Avery की family में, how the mother is crying, how they are waiting for justice to happen.
Those elements I felt were repetitive. That I agree with you on, because look, we've gone through the family's trauma in season 1. So every time it touches on the trauma in season 2, it's something that you've seen before. But at the same time, you can't do away with it, right? You can't be that insensitive to the characters that you're telling your story about. And like we spoke about, because it's a smaller time frame, there aren't as many developments in the case. But, for somebody, I think Making a Murderer has gone beyond being just an entertaining show.
Yeah.
I think people feel strongly about the Avery family. People feel strongly about him getting justice. And personally, I would watch any future season that would even just sort of update me on what is happening and give me the details out. I'll be happy doing that, because I am no more watching it purely for entertainment. I am watching
now
it to see.
Personally invested.
I am personally invested.
Correct. We may criticize it, come back on this podcast and we say kya pakaya, but we will still watch it.
We will still watch it. And that's the power of Netflix, right?
All right. So with that, it's a wrap on this episode, you guys. Let us know what you think of The Jinx. Let us know what you think of Making a Murderer, both season 1 and season 2. Let us know what are your other favorite documentaries and what platforms they're on. Anything else you want to add, Guha, before we wrap up?
I think true crime as a genre is one that Janice and I will keep returning to. So this was just really a small taste of all the true crime documentaries that we've watched. So this was just meant to be a bit of a sort of a fresher course on true crime documentaries. And in future, we'll be back with a lot more true crime fiction and non-fiction recommendations.
Yeah, in future, we're going to do a drinking game where every time Ani and I say true crime, you guys do a shot, because that's how much we love true crime.
Yeah.
And if you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on our social media pages. We are at IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to Aniruddha and me on our social media pages, well, I'm at JaniceSec85 on Twitter and Instagram. And the hubs is at Ani Guha on Instagram and Twitter. It is time for us to officially say bye-bye. Guha, say bye-bye.
Bye.
We'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Every week comes a show where 3 people come together to tell you about stuff they like. A movie, a TV show, a book, and other stuff. Tune in every Monday on the IVM Podcast app to IVM Likes. Batman approves this message. Thank you, Batman.
Family businesses get a bad rap. At one time, they were looked down on for getting rich, for being too ambitious. Today, they're still looked down on, but for not being ambitious enough. Not agile enough, not modern enough, too traditional in their mindset. The biggest brands and business houses in the country started out as humble family businesses. It's the way India has done business. Join Sonu Bhasin in conversation with stalwarts of Indian family businesses on the Inheritors podcast series by Bloomberg Quint. Discuss the highs and lows, the needs and pressure points of building a business legacy that spans generations.